So, one case in WA,
Pleasure, Pete.
do you believe this shutdown was necessary?
Well, obviously, that's been the medical advice to the WA Premier, and the other premiers have reacted as a result of that. I know the doctors are particularly worried about the UK and the South African strains. They're more infectious, and therefore, I suppose you've had this reaction. It makes it difficult, of course, for businesses and for people who are trying to, keep the doors open, keep staff employed in restaurants, etc., when you get these snap lockdowns. But I think it's important for the premiers to properly explain the rationale, the thinking behind it, because for some in business, when you get one case and you get millions of people locked down, I think they need that explained to them to have a proper understanding of the logic behind such a quick lockdown.
So you support that logic from Mark McGowan and also the corresponding decisions that have been made by various premiers since that lockdown was announced?
Yes, but I don't have the medical advice available to me. They're acting on the medical advice, and that's the decision that's been made. Obviously, WA has taken a very stern approach to their border arrangements from the start, and as we saw in Queensland in the run-up to an election, there was, I think a bit of panic by Anastasia Palaszczuk at the moment at that time, and then if you look at what's happening today post-election. There's a more reasonable, more measured approach, and WA is going into an election in March, so there's all of that dynamic as well. Premiers don't want viruses getting away and the state to be in a lockdown over an election period. So obviously WA's made this decision, and it's for Premier McGowan to explain the logic and reasoning and give as much detail as possible to the public so they know exactly what's behind the decision making.
Given that Australia had that 6-day pause to travellers coming from New Zealand as well, does it seem that we are shooting for elimination now right across the board?
Well, I think that's been the stated objective from Premier McGowan, but that's not the case for the other state and territory premiers and chief ministers, and certainly the Prime Minister's spoken from day one about suppressing this virus. We've got obviously an incredible opportunity as an island nation to keep it from our shores, and hence the hotel quarantine being important for people returning back from overseas, as we've seen in a number of cases now where people have presented in quarantine with the virus having been overseas. And that was the decision that we took last year at the start of this, that we needed to take advantage of our geographic location. We took a decision originally to close our border to China and then to the rest of the world. And that is, I think, what stood us in good stead, and the health response has been quite remarkable since the securing of the vaccine, which is something Greg Hunt's been working on day and night, again puts us in the best possible position. We were an early mover compared to other countries around the world, and we were able to start the vaccination rollout within the coming weeks, and that will give us further advantage.
I do want to ask you about vaccination, but just one more on borders at the moment. John Barilaro, he tweeted last night, WA's hard domestic border lockdown has proved pointless. WA has learnt firsthand an elimination strategy is unrealistic. There has been an ongoing stoush between the New South Wales and the WA governments for a little while now, but what do you make of those comments?
Look, Pete, I think in terms of an elimination strategy, it might be a great sort of political slogan, but it's not a realistic approach to this virus. You will send businesses broke. The surge in domestic violence when people are in lockdown for a long period of time, the inability for people to pay their mortgage repayments, to pay their bills, the pressure when they've got kids at home for extended periods of time instead of being at school. All of that compounds, into a negative outcome for many families. And as we've seen in other states and territories, there is an ability to track and trace, and there's been an enormous amount of resource, not just dollars, but human resource and training of doctors and nurses and experts to do the tracing. The whole experience we've seen in New South Wales or in South Australia or Queensland, wherever it might be, there's been the ability for the public health authorities to track and trace and to quarantine those people. Originally in Queensland, the approach was, as was the case in Victoria, to lock the whole state down. And, you know, when you get a case in Coolangatta and you're closing down Cooktown, it makes people angry. So if there is a single case and it doesn't spread beyond that, then people rightly at the end of this period scratch their head and say, well, was that necessary? And that's what the Premier needs to answer. If the approach is for an elimination, thousands of people will lose their jobs and businesses will close unnecessarily. Now, as was the case in Queensland, we've got to be careful that the strategy is not to, you know, to scare people, which is what Premier Palaszczuk was doing, because she panicked. And if you're scaring people and then you're resolving it 3 days later after only one case and people applaud you for that, well, I suppose that's encouragement for the Premier to do the same thing in the next period. So there needs to be a common sense approach here, but elimination over suppression is not the approach that is going to stand our country in good stead.
Yeah, and of all the sectors, it's the tourism sector that's being battered the hardest at the moment. In Queensland, it is a notable standout at this stage. You would have seen Premier Palaszczuk's comments last week asking the federal government for some assistance when it comes to that. What sort of assistance do you think will be needed for the tourism sector beyond March?
Well, Peter, I think it's more tailored now. The approach that we've taken right from the start is to provide support to businesses. If we hadn't put in place JobKeeper, then we would have seen tens of thousands of businesses go into receivership. People would have lost their homes, people would have lost their jobs, and it would have been very hard for confidence to remain at the levels that we've been able to maintain it at, which has been quite remarkable. So not just JobKeeper, but we've had instant asset write-off. We've had a huge investment into the first home buyer housing market. So the activity that's generated there, the tradies that are buying new utes or are putting a new apprentice on, shops that are fitting out their new premises, people who are making investments into farming machinery, all of that has been a significant multiplier, not just into their own businesses and their own communities, but more broadly across the country. So the farmer then is going to, take a holiday in Cairns, or the small business owner is going to spend money at cafes on the Gold Coast or wherever it might be. So I think it's important to recognise what the federal government's done already, the success of that, and that should give people confidence that whatever we do in the days, months and hopefully not years, but the year ahead, hopefully we can provide that support in a more tailored way, because there are some tourism products that are doing quite well because of the domestic demand, and there are others that rely completely on an international market, which clearly is not going to be the case for this calendar year at least.
Most of the year, yeah, that's right. Yeah, and just finally, and the Prime Minister's got his speech today. He's going to talk about a range of issues. The vaccine is going to be one of them. A lot of critics at the moment are having a go at what they believe is a slow rollout of the vaccine in Australia, bearing in mind that some 600,000 Brits have already been vaccinated. It's 1% of the population. Do you have any concerns about it being too long, it taking too long for the vaccine to come to Australia?
No, I don't, Pete. I mean, when you look at Australians, we have a massive uptake of vaccination. I think the rate's at 95, 96, 97%. And people do that because they have faith and trust in our doctors, in our scientists, and the TGA, whilst it's very annoying for a lot of companies because the process is very long, they do necessary trials, they look at the experience around the world, and Anthony Albanese was calling for this vaccination to be rolled out even before the TGA was prepared to authorise that rollout. So I think that was, in hindsight, a mistake. I think Labor would admit that, and maybe some politics with it as well. But the government's taken the decision that we aren't going to subvert processes. There are no shortcuts here. When you've got a rollout of a new drug, you want to be making sure that it's going to do what the manufacturers claim it'll do, that is protect us from the virus. But you also want to make sure that it's going to keep our population healthy and safe. And it hasn't hurt us looking at what's happened in other parts of the world, not just the United Kingdom, but what's happened in Germany, Norway, elsewhere. We'll learn from all of that, and that should give the public an absolute assurance that it is safe to have this vaccine, and for the community to get up and running again, it's a necessary part of dealing with what otherwise is a very infectious disease.